Okay, let's finish off this rigged character using EDAP Tools Smart Magnet Rigs with full forward and inverse kinematics.
TipTut.
Hello everybody and welcome back to TipTut, and welcome back to the second and final episode of the Animating and Rigging with the EDAP Toolset series. Now, last episode, if you haven't watched that already, we built this character here and the basic symbols needed to create the rig. And then in this episode, we will actually be rigging this guy for full forward and inverse kinematics, which is a lot of fun. So in between episodes, I went in, like I said I would, and cleaned up the symbols so that we've got a nicer looking character here. And I've done all the details that I want as well. Now, before we jump into the rigging, it's important to make sure that our character's symbols are correctly registered for rigging. So let's do that first. What I mean by that is, for example, the torso should have the anchor point at the bottom. I believe at the last end of the last episode, it was at the top. So how you do that is you would just drag your transform point over the same point as your hips and then just press Shift T like we did in the last episode to re-anchor that. So basically go through all of your symbols and just make sure that your registration and transform points are all in the correct positions for your rig. The other thing that you need to do is make sure that coming off of your torso or your core element, any inverse kinematic rigs should only have 3 components to them. There should be an upper arm, lower arm, and a hand. And for the legs, there should be an upper leg, lower leg, and a foot. Now, in the last episode, if you remember, we had the toes as separate symbols. So you just need to take your toe and just place it inside your foot symbol so that the foot and the toes are a single symbol as opposed to 2. And on your hands, just make sure that you take your lantern like this by just cutting and popping it inside your hand symbol with a quick paste. Now, it might be rotated. If it is, that's fine. You can just sprint him background like so and drop him onto the hand. So now you can see we have an upper arm, a lower arm, and then a hand with the lantern inside of it. Again, if you press Shift T, it will conform that bounding box a little bit better. And we have a glow around our lantern. That's why this bounding box here is so big. The last thing you need to do is make sure that coming off of the neck, you've just got the one head symbol. At the moment, our head is made up of lots of tiny little things here, as you can see. So we want to select everything but the head and pop it inside the head layer. So we'll select all the layers here. So hair dangle, ear, the dangle back, the hat head, the beak top, the beak pot, the hat decoration, the hat hinge, the hat neck, and the hat base. We'll right click and just choose cut layers, and that'll cut all those layers away until we're left with just the head by itself. Double click inside the head and we will paste the layers. Now, it's not going to paste them all in place, but it will paste them all in relation to each other, which is great. And for now, I'm actually just going to drag all of these on top of everything just so that we can easily see where they should be placed correctly. And that's great. And then we'll just pop them in the right order. And the things that should be in front are this dangly piece of hair here and the ear. And I think that works. So now we've got all of those layers inside of this symbol, and we will be doing animation inside here. So all of the head and hat movement and things like that will be done inside this symbol. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to give myself a whole bunch of layers. Let's just do 35 for now. And the shortcut for this with the EDAP toolset is just Z. And then when we pop back out of the head, we can select the head here, go over to our looping options in properties and set it to just play graphic once. Everything else, except for the head, we want to set the looping to be a single keyframe, except for this hand here. We want that hand to also be play graphic once because we're going to have some flickering fire and things like that. And that's just going to set us up ready so that we can animate it easier later on. So our character is now ready to be rigged. I'm just going to delete these additional layers that I do not need. And we're going to rig him using the flexible rigging system from EDAP. Okay, so I have saved this guy as a new document just so that I've got that other one safe and squirreled away in case I make any horrendous cock-ups. And you're going to want to make sure you have a couple of windows open. Essentially, you go to Windows Extensions, make sure you have Smart Magnet Rig Helpers open, and that'll be this little panel down here with all of these convenient buttons. And with that open, you are ready to start rigging. Now, I recommend you rig from what you want to be the main controller of your character. So you can see here I have this hips layer with just the hips and the underside of the belt in it. And I want that to be my core starting point of my rig. So I'm going to press F4, which brings up the rigging, so the freestyle rigging tool, or you can press this sort of keychain thing on your toolbar. If you don't see these on your toolbar, you can press the 3 dots and they will be in here in their own section. You can just drag those out to your toolbar. So with those selected, I'm going to click and drag from my hips to my torso. Now, as soon as I select this, you'll notice that the symbol I have selected has a cross through it, and that's the symbol you're starting with. The symbol you connect it to will have a green bounding box around it, and when you release, you'll get a pop-up in your output window saying torso, and that's the upper torso, is now connected to hips, which is the starting point of our rig. Okay, so you just want to make sure that when you are clicking and dragging, you do definitely have the right thing. You haven't accidentally selected a different element. If you think you're going to make a mistake with the mouse held down still, you can just press escape and that will cancel out so that you can not make a mistake. But you can also do things like hide the layers you think you might be accidentally selecting until you're ready to select them. So we can go back to our freestyle rig here and I can just choose, for example, the torso, which I now know is connected to the hips, and I can click and drag from the torso to the neck. But you'll also see that the hips now have a gray bounding box with no cross, and this means that they are connected to this element. When I release to connect it to the neck, and then I click from the neck to the head, you'll notice that the neck now has the gray bounding box with the cross because that is the source of the connection. So I'm going to keep doing this. We now have hips to torso to neck to head. Okay. I'm going to turn my shield back on and I'm going to go from torso again over to shield. And then so that I don't accidentally select it, I'm going to hide the shield. And again, you can see in your output panel that the things you have connected are correct. Okay. Let's go from and do one of the arms. Let's go from the torso to the upper arm down to the lower arm, and the lower arm down to the sword. From the torso, let's go to the other arm, the other upper arm to the other lower arm, and the other lower arm to the other hand, like so. From the hips, let's make sure we have the hips selected and drag to the upper leg down to the lower leg. See there, I've selected the wrong one, so I'm going to press escape, and I'm just going to select it a little bit more accurately. And the lower leg down to the foot. And let's do the other thing here, from the hips over to the upper leg to the lower leg. Again, having trouble selecting that there, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my left hand and hide that, and that should allow me to more easily select the correct element. You see there, lower leg is connected to upper leg, which is good because you could have accidentally selected the lantern there. And here we have now connected the foot. So let's turn back on all of our elements. And the best way to test whether you have done this correctly is to take your core element using the move tool, just move it anywhere else, press 1, which is the shortcut once you have done the smart magnet rigs, to select all children. So obviously all the children of the main element is going to be everything else. And then press tilde, which is usually next to one on the keyboard, to snap everything back to the new smart magnets that you have now made. If it does that, then your rig is set up correctly. Okay, I'll just undo those movements. But what this means is now, if I accidentally, using the move tool, move one of my elements away, I can just press tilde to bring it back to the smart magnet point that it is connected to. You can see this smart magnet point by clicking inside the symbol, and you'll see you have 2 or 1 new layers depending on where it is in the hierarchy. You have a magnet target. So for example, the elbow on the lower arm would snap back to this magnet target if you were to move it away. And you have a center marker, which is where your registration and transform point is. And you'll have those inside all of your elements that are connected to your rig. Anything that is on the tail or the end of a connection will only have a center marker because there's obviously nothing that will be snapping to it. So with that in mind, you are now ready for forward kinematics. So if you press G, which is the shortcut for the Kineflex tool, the tool that you use to manipulate your rig, you can now click and select any element to rig in a similar way to the built-in bone tool rigs. If you click and drag, you'll get this kind of soft rotation. And if you hold Alt whilst clicking and dragging, you get hard rotation, which extends all the way down to the children. So you can make them stab like this. If you're experiencing a little bit of lag, you can go to View, Preview mode, and change it to Fast. That will just make things look a little bit more crunchy. And your forward kinematics is pretty much ready to go. You can start using your keyframes and animating and things like that. Now, if you have the premium version, you can use inverse kinematics. But even if you don't, I will say do continue watching, because there are cleanup steps that you do after you've done your animation, regardless of whether you're using forward or inverse kinematics. If you don't have the premium version, get it. It's definitely worth the money, unless you're one of our lucky winners, in which case, good for you. So clicking and dragging, soft rotation, holding Alt, hard rotation. Clicking whilst holding Shift will move your arm or whatever away from the rig if you need to do that. So that's the beauty of this flexible system here. You can break the bone system in a way that you can't with the basic bone system that you have in Adobe Animate. One issue you can see here is that I've selected the upper arm. I pressed tilde to bring him back to the body, but the rest of the arm didn't follow. There's also a really great shortcut system where if you have one parent selected and you press 1 on the keyboard, it selects all the children, like we did with the hips. So you can bring that back like so. There is also a inverse. So if I select the hand and then press Shift 1, it will go all the way up to the elbow and place the transform point there so that you can select the other end of the chain, essentially. Select your child and go up through the parents. For forward kinematics, that's pretty much it. It's very simple. For inverse kinematics, there's a few extra things you can do to make this way more powerful. So let's jump into that. Okay, so inverse kinematics is where this gets really fun. You can pin elements in place. You can animate up the chain using one drag handle. It's very impressive. Essentially, the best way to check that your inverse kinematics are going to work is to pin what is called an IK effector to each wrist and foot. So the best way to do this is just to select an element and press the shortcut Shift F1. So if you wanted to attach something to control the foot, for example, you'd attach it to the lower leg, choose IK effector or press Shift F1. And that's going to create an IK controller, essentially, that allows you to control that one leg. You'll notice it comes up as a symbol that's put on its own layer called Smart Magnet Rig Controllers. And you'll want to do that for both legs. So I'll select this lower leg as well and press Shift F1 and it'll do the exact same thing. Now, if I were to go to my Kineflex tool with G and I'm going to drag my hips down whilst holding Shift, that will allow me to move the hips like so. And you'll notice that the legs, whilst they bend the wrong way, do in fact bend. And if I drag those hips up as well, when the legs reach their full extension, they will float off of the floor. When they reach their original position, they will start to bend again. To control elements with inverse kinematics, clicking and dragging will rotate the original element whilst affecting the children. Doing so whilst holding Alt will do hard rotation, similar to the forward kinematics. And doing so while holding Shift will allow you to move those objects around. So exactly the same controls as the forward kinematics, okay? Now, obviously there, his legs look a little bit broken because they are bending the wrong way. So if we drag those hips down, you notice that this leg's probably bending okay, but this leg here is bending the wrong direction. And you can flip that horizontally by going down to your effector properties with the effector selected and choosing clockwise, like so. That will flip it the other direction. Then with Kineflex selected, if I hold Shift and click and drag the hips, those legs will bend in the right direction, okay? Now, obviously at the moment, his skirt does not expand to match, but that's where one of these very useful shortcuts is going to come in. So I'm going to bend to the lowest extent that I want him to be able to squat with this character, like so. I'm also going to make the legs limited by selecting this effector as well and say effector properties. Then I'm going to go to my minimum value and click Get, and that's going to change the minimum value to whatever the angle is at the moment, which means then when I drag this guy around, he's going to be able to stand up to his full extent, but when he squats, he'll stop at a certain point and his leg will start to sink through the floor. If you don't want that behavior, you can, of course, just leave that behavior off. So I'm going to reset it for now because I don't quite know where I want the extremities to be, but that's just a nice little joint constraint there, which can be quite useful. But what I do want to do is expand this skirt so that when he's squatting, his legs don't pop out the side. So let's just turn off both of these hands so it's a little bit easier to see what I'm talking about. And we're just going to do a basic thing that we always do in Adobe Animate, which is to add interior frames that we can switch between at will. So I'm going to double click to go inside my hips, and I'm going to give myself maybe, let's say 12 frames. The shortcut for this is Z with the EDAP Toolset. And I'm going to go to my skirt layer here and press X to create an advanced keyframe. I'll just turn that message off so it doesn't come up all the time. And I'm just going to drag the points of my skirt, my character's skirt, until they extend past the knees. Making sure the skirt looks good in this position. Okie doke. Let's right click and choose create shape tween between those 2 points. And you'll notice we'll now get a little shape tween that goes from closed skirt to open skirt. Let's select all of those frames, right click and choose convert to frame by frame animation, keyframe every frame. And now we have a series of frames that we can pick between. When we go back to scene 1, because we've already set our hips here to be play a single frame, we can now choose what frame we want in the same way we would with any keyframe frame picker. However, there's a brilliant shortcut, which is Shift, comma, or stop, and you can cycle through those frames really easily. So I can say when my character's squatting, just show that frame on his skirt layer, essentially. Okay, and then of course, if I bring him back up on the next keyframe, I would just say, okay, that's no good. I want him to go back down to probably this one, which still covers up both of those legs. You can rotate him to your heart's content. Okay, so that's quite useful, but let's pop him back on like fully stood up, and let's pop his skirt back down to fully closed. Awesome. Now, for the legs, those IK effectors will work perfectly, but because for the hands we have different children, if we actually go inside, you'll notice that we have 2 magnet targets on the wrists, one for the sword hand and one for the lantern hand. So if I were to connect this with a IK effector by pressing Shift F1, we'd actually get a warning. And this warning says here, to attach a smart effector to an element with multiple magnet targets, which are those little red circles, you need to separate one magnet target from the rest and make it the primary magnet target for Smart Magnet Rig IK purposes. They're close enough together that it's going to work fine. So what we'll do is we will take this IK effector, press Kineflex, that's the shortcut G to bring up the Kineflex tool. And whilst holding Shift, we will then drag it over the arm. And what this will do is pop us inside the symbol. It'll create a new magnet target layer, okay? And we're going to take one of these. Let's take this upper one here. We'll cut that and we'll paste it in place on the top layer. Then when we go back outside and we shift drag over this limb with the Kineflex tool again, it will now work and we can start dragging and using our inverse kinematics, okay? Ooh, lovely, look at that. Now this one is rotating the correct way, so that's fine. Let's do the same over here. Shift F1 is the same symbol, so it should just work this time. And again, this is now working perfectly. So we now have 4 IK effectors pinning all of our elements into place. And you'll notice that I can, holding Shift, moving the hips, all 4 limbs will remain in place as I drag my character around. Now this is bloody awesome. One last useful thing to show you before we move on to animating, and this isn't the limit of the toolset, this is just one thing that I found useful, is I can extend like the controller with a guided shape. So for example, if I want to control my neck here, it might be quite hard to actually click and find it and make him do like the walk like an Egyptian dance, yeah? But clicking and finding that with all these elements over it is going to be quite difficult. So what we're going to do is we're going to do a forward kinematics extender. So we're going to double click inside this neck symbol and we're going to click the FK extender button, and that's going to create this little blue circle for us here. What this will allow us to do is essentially using this circle, we can drag it above the head. Let's just pop it directly above the neck like so. What this allows us to do is when we pop back outside our neck and we go back to our Kineflex tool with G, we can now control the neck from this handle. And obviously it's a little bit easier to control as well because the neck is quite a small area. When you click and drag, a few pixels of movement have a drastic difference on how far the neck moves, whereas the further away the FK effector is, the easier it is to control, okay? So now we can just start posing to our heart's content. Okay, we can sort of make this leg move around. We can click and rotate the body. You know, we can rotate the head. We can rotate the neck on the head. And between holding Alt and Shift, you can get used to the different kinds of movements that you can do with your forward kinematics and inverse kinematics effectors. Now, this is obviously a lot of shortcuts and things to remember. So they include, which is incredible, a interactive tutorial, essentially, that reminds you of all of this sort of stuff. If you scroll all the way down to EDAP Help, or the shortcut for that is Shift and then 0, it brings up this interactive help panel, and you can click on the Kineflex Interactive Help, and hovering over these elements on the right here will tell you exactly what they do. Dragging for forward kinematics, alt dragging for inverse kinematics, and etc. All these different elements. Now, it also goes over all the shortcuts, like things I didn't cover, like flipping direction of IK effectors and things like that. Very, very useful panel. We love it. With that in mind, let's take a look at doing a very simple animation in real time. And then, of course, I'll go through and animate it properly in fast forward mode because you do not want to be here for like an hour. But there is one final important thing to understand, and that is how Adobe Animate handles tweening and things like that. And there are two tools that you can use to clean up an animation once you've figured out the main poses. So let's talk about them, and then we'll fully animate this character. Okay, so let's talk about animation then. It works in exactly the same as a standard classic tween workflow. But of course, when you tween with Adobe Animate, it moves linearly. So it will move one symbol from point A to point 3 on a linear path. And as we all know, animation looks beautiful on curves, not on linear paths. So once you have set the keyframes and tweened between them, there'll be two different types of cleanup you can do that will make your animations follow the arcs as if it were a properly parented rig. So what does all that mean? I'm going to tell you, don't worry. Let's take our first character's pose here, for example, and say we're happy with that. And I'm just going to move over to, I don't know, let's say frame 24. Let's do an even second. And I'll just press Z to bring all of those frames over. And then on everything except the Smart Magnet Rig controllers and the background, I will press X to create some nice keyframes. Okay, so we have a second of animation that we're going to be working with here. This will not be beautiful. This will just be a good example, okay? So in this second pose, I'm going to say I want him to go back to where he was. Let's go to frame 12. Let's press X to bring in some keyframes again. And let's just have him do like a little sway. We'll have him sway back and forth a little bit, okay? So let's move this over to about frame 8. And then on around frame 16, we can have another keyframe like so. So we have 4 keyframes that are exactly the same. On frame 8, let's do a little bit of posing. So let's select Kineflex with G, and I'm going to have my character sort of sway backwards. So holding Shift, I'm going to move the hips. Let's have him squat down just a little bit. Okay. We're now going to want to press Shift and full stop to expand the skirt so that it covers his back legs there. And let's bring this hand in and down a bit, and let's bring that lantern down a bit as well. Let's have him, as he moves back, I think he'd raise the lantern to see what's in the darkness. And I think he'd raise his sword arm a little bit too. I also think he'd shift his head forward slightly. And I think he'd lower his chin. Now, we're only controlling the top level elements. Of course, you would do a multi-pass animation, go back through inside the head symbol and animate, you know, the hat flapping and the ears and hair swaying and things like that. I'm going to do all of that in fast forward mode. Okay. I want his back foot to move back a little bit as he shifts his weight onto it. And let's rotate his hips so he compensates for that weight just a little bit. And lift our lantern. So we now have these two poses. Fairly similar, but that's okay. From here, let's then say he's going to then sway forward. So we're back to our original pose. From here, we have our original pose. So let's rotate these guys back in the other direction. Now, because we have these, and of course, there's absolutely nothing stopping you from turning on your onion skin to see what the previous poses were like. And you can start positioning these guys out. So let's not holding Shift rather, but holding nothing. Let's just shift his body weight forwards. Let's hold Shift to move the hips forward. Like so, and you'll notice that back leg immediately straights itself out. Let's twist these hips to compensate, and let's open up his skirt just one more level. And let's bring that hand up like so. I think this arm would come up as well. I think he'd bring his head forward a little bit more too. So just doing this very quickly. That's going to go back to the original pose there. Okay, great. So we've got 4 poses. Let's turn off our onion skin tool. Pose 1, pose 2, he leans forward to pose 3, and he goes back to reset to pose 4. Let's grab all of these layers here and right click and choose Create Classic Tween. There are new shortcuts. If you have a numpad on your keyboard, you can just press numpad 4 instead. So I'm going to do that for a classic tween. And you'll notice, bam, our character is now animated. Awesome. You'll also notice that the skirt does indeed jump up on that last keyframe. So you would find the point where you think the skirt needs to expand instead. I think that's actually slightly earlier than that. And I will select my skirt. I'll create a new keyframe and I will expand it to there. Boom, looks pretty nice to me. Let's say on this keyframe as well, it needs to expand like that. So now it expands smoothly, which is nice. Okay. For the rest of this, we're going to just do a little bit of simple easing. So I'm just going to grab all of these and we'll just do a little bit of simple ease in and out. Let's say cubic. And then here we'll do the same thing. Let's press numpad 4 for a classic tween, and he's going to shift forwards on his way. For this one, we'll also do a bit of simple easing. Again, I'm just kind of rushing through this as an example. Now he's moving forward like that. And then he's going to come back on this last frame here. Press numpad 4 for a bit of a classic tween, and we'll do the same thing again. Let's do cubic again. So now if we press test, we've got this nice smooth animation. Okay. Now, at the moment, this doesn't really need a lot of cleaning up because there isn't anything too dramatic happening. So let's add in a dramatic pose to show how it will break in a more dramatic pose, and then we'll clean that up. Okay, so we have a slightly more dramatic and interesting animation here. Is it the most beautiful animation in the world? No, but it does demonstrate exactly what I want to talk about, and that is this idea of needing to clean up. So you can see that when we animate our guys here, there are some frames, because of the linear motion of the way that Adobe Animate works, where like your elbow joints break a little bit and things like that. Or even on this deep squat here, you can notice the knee joints breaking a little bit and popping out of position. Now, usually in like a bone-based rig, you'd use like layer parenting or something like that. And you can do exactly that in EDAP tools as well. But there are times when that is the best way to work, and there are times when using IK or FK cleanup is the best way to work. So for example, to use the parenting rigging will usually work best on upper body elements that aren't like stuck to the floor or things like that. So I'm going to select everything from the torso upwards by going to a keyframe and selecting all of these guys. We don't want the legs in there and we don't want the hips in there. So we basically got everything except the legs selected on this one here. And what we're going to do is just press the semicolon shortcut key. And you'll notice that every layer that has selected has now got PL, which is layer parenting or parented layer, I suppose, attached. And that's going to essentially straight up just fix any of those issues. You notice now that these elbows, at no point do they pop off and we get a beautiful arcing animation like so. However, the legs do still break, but if we were to use layer parenting for those, let me show you what would happen. I'm going to pop these guys onto my selection here, and I'm going to press semicolon. Because they are layer parented, if they ever move down, he's going to sort of bounce and start freaking out a little bit like so, and we don't want that. And that's why we don't use layer parenting for these layers. I'm just going to undo that. So what we are going to do is do something called IK cleanup. And to do that, we're just going to select our IK effectors, press tilde so that they are back in position. And then we're going to click the IK cleanup option here. And that's going to go through, and you'll notice that anywhere where it's going to break between the first and next keyframe, it's added in a keyframe. So it's converted like when you convert to a frame by frame animation. So let's do that for this leg too. So go back here and we'll press IK cleanup. You'll notice it's done it for that leg now. And now in between these points, neither of those legs break. Okay. So let's go through and do that for both of these. Let's select both of them. You can't do two at a time. You have to do them one at a time. So we'll just do these one at a time and select IK cleanup for this leg and IK cleanup for this leg. Now, the reason it only does it from one keyframe to the next is because on some of these, you're not going to need it. And obviously, once you're doing the IK cleanup here, you are kind of burning this animation in. You're kind of baking it a little bit. You can obviously undo it, clear the keyframes, blah, blah, blah. So this should be the last step. You should get your animation where you want it to be and then do the cleanup, essentially. Excuse me, I accidentally just moved our guy there. So now, as you can see, as our character moves about, his legs do not break anymore, okay? His knees don't break. They stay in the correct position, which is very nice. I do need to come through and adjust my skirt, but that's just my fault. I'm bad at animating, and I forgot to rotate my boy's skirt a little bit. So I'm going to go through and clean that up, and then we can see the actually properly finished animation. One last thing to note is that if I try to change this animation, for example, to take this hand here and make him thrust forward with the sword on this frame, for example, by selecting the IK effector, it will tell me off because I've got the layer parenting shell on top. So you actually just need to turn that off. I'll just go back to the first frame and I'll select everything except my legs again, like so. And I'll just press semicolon to turn all of that off. And then back to where I need to go, I'll drag with the Kineflex tool my effector, give it a little thrust, like so. Let's just position this guy. Stretch him out. Just rotate the sword a bit, like so. Now that animation takes place, and then it's just a case of turning your layer parenting back on with the semicolon key. So the great thing about this layer parenting is that it's completely flexible as well. You can turn it on and off as desired so that you can go back and tweak your animation if you need to. Okay, so that's a fairly basic animation. What I'm going to do now is go and spend a little bit of time making a real proper animation, and then we can jump back in to show you what a little bit of time with this tool can do. If you are after a super detailed breakdown of how all these tools work, I'll be probably making more videos on this in the future, but the EDAP Tools YouTube channel is an incredible resource for all of the nitty gritty, as you can probably imagine. So do go over to their channel and check that out, and you will learn everything you need to know about this incredibly expansive tool set. In the meantime, let's enjoy this little animation time lapse, and we'll jump back in once it is all done. So there you have it, an absolutely flyby introduction to the world of EDAP rigging. It is an incredible tool set. I highly recommend you grab a hold of it. It has changed the way Adobe Animate works probably forever, and hopefully Adobe will recognize this and start to improve Adobe Animate so that it can once again become an industry standard animation tool. Thank you so much for watching, everybody. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. If you did, make sure to like, comment, subscribe, etc. Go check out the Flanimate Power Tools EDAP Toolset channel. And I'll see you next time for another episode of TipTut, probably in the world of animation, because that's where I love to be. I'll see you then. It's 3 a.m, so I have to be incredibly quiet, but do not mistake the volume of my voice for lack of enthusiasm. My members are bloody lovely, and it's kind of creepy that I'm whispering in their ears.
Remember to subscribe for more tips, tricks, and tutorials. Thanks for watching.